If you're over 55, or if someone you care about is, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to explain. Because there's a phase that happens in the body, a quiet period of internal change, that most people pass through without ever knowing it's happening. And it's during this phase, not afterward, that the trajectory of your health gets determined. We often hear about aging as if it's a smooth, predictable decline, a gradual wearing down. But that's not what we see in the data. What we see instead are people who appear stable, functional, independent, and then within months, sometimes weeks, they experience what looks like sudden deterioration. A fall that leads to hospitalization, a minor infection that spirals, a stroke that seemed to come out of nowhere. And when we look back at their medical records, everything appeared fine just months earlier. Blood pressure managed, cholesterol controlled, no red flags. But here's what we've learned. That decline wasn't sudden at all. It was preceded by a silent physiological phase where the body's regulatory systems were already destabilizing, quietly and invisibly. And because this phase produces almost no symptoms, because it doesn't show up clearly on standard tests, and because most doctors aren't specifically looking for it, it gets missed. Consistently. This isn't about fear, it's about understanding. Because once you recognize what this phase looks like from the inside, biologically speaking, you can actually do something about it. Let me explain what's actually happening during this overlooked period. Your cardiovascular system, the network of vessels that delivers oxygen and nutrients to every cell in your body, operates on a principle that most people don't think about. It's not just a set of pipes. It's a dynamic, responsive system that constantly adjusts based on demand. When you stand up, these vessels constrict in your legs and dilate in your brain to maintain blood flow. When you eat, blood redirects to your digestive system. This happens automatically, thousands of times per day, regulated by signals your body sends through chemicals, nerve impulses, and pressure sensors embedded in your vessel walls. The key player in this system is something called the endothelium. This is the thin inner lining of your blood vessels, just one cell layer thick, but it's one of the most metabolically active tissues in your entire body. The endothelium produces a molecule called nitric oxide, which is essentially the master regulator of vascular function. Nitric oxide tells your vessels when to relax, when to constrict, how to respond to changing conditions. It also prevents inflammation from taking hold in vessel walls and maintains the smooth flow of blood. Now here's what happens as we age, particularly after age 55 or 60. The endothelium's ability to produce nitric oxide begins to decline. This isn't because of disease necessarily. It's a gradual reduction in cellular efficiency. The enzymes that manufacture nitric oxide become less effective. The raw materials needed for production become less available. Oxidative stress increases and breaks down nitric oxide faster than it can be replaced. Inflammation, even low-grade chronic inflammation that produces no symptoms, damages endothelial cells and impairs their function. The result is a slow erosion of vascular responsiveness. Your blood vessels become less flexible, less able to dilate when needed, less efficient at directing blood flow. But here's the critical point. For a long time, you don't notice, because your body compensates. It increases blood pressure slightly to maintain flow. It increases heart rate. It shifts resources. The system is still functional. You still feel fine. This is the phase. This is what gets missed. During this period, which can last months or even years, your internal physiology is changing in ways that don't produce obvious symptoms. Your vessels are stiffening gradually. Your blood pressure is creeping upward, maybe still within normal range, but higher than it was 5 years ago. Your body's ability to regulate inflammation is weakening. Small deposits of calcium begin forming in arterial walls. The kidneys, which depend on precise blood flow to filter waste, start working slightly less efficiently. Your brain, which requires 20% of your body's blood supply, begins receiving marginally less oxygen during moments of peak demand. None of this is dramatic. None of this sends you to the emergency room. Your annual physical might show numbers that are slightly elevated, but not alarming. Your doctor might say, everything looks good for your age, and you feel fine. Maybe a bit more tired than you used to be, but that seems normal. Maybe you get a little dizzy when you stand up quickly, but you adjust. Maybe you notice you don't recover from physical exertion quite as fast, but you assume that's just getting older. But what's actually happening is that your body is losing its physiological reserve. That's the technical term, reserve capacity. It's the difference between what your body needs to function at rest and what it's capable of producing under stress. When you're young, that gap is enormous. Your heart can increase its output 5 or 6 times if needed. But as reserve capacity declines, that gap narrows. And here's why this matters so much. When something stresses your system, when you get an infection, when you experience dehydration, when you have a sleepless night or emotional stress, your body needs that reserve to respond. If the reserve is depleted, even a small stressor can push you past a threshold where compensation is no longer possible. That's when we see what looks like sudden decline. But it's not sudden. It's the culmination of a process that's been unfolding silently. Let me give you a clinical example. We see patients in their late 60s or early 70s who come in after a fall. They broke a hip, or they hit their head, and now they're hospitalized. When we take the history, we find out the fall happened because they felt lightheaded getting out of bed. That lightheadedness occurred because their blood pressure didn't adjust quickly enough when they stood up. Their vessels didn't constrict in their legs fast enough to maintain flow to their brain. Why? Because endothelial function had declined to the point where the system couldn't respond appropriately. But if you'd tested that person's blood pressure 2 months earlier while they were sitting calmly in a doctor's office, it might have looked perfectly fine. The problem wasn't resting blood pressure. It was dynamic regulation, the ability to adjust in real time. And we don't test for that routinely. Similarly, we see people who develop sudden cognitive symptoms, confusion, or memory problems that seem to appear out of nowhere. When we investigate, we often find that cerebral blood flow has been gradually declining for years. The brain has remarkable ability to compensate for reduced oxygen delivery. It shifts metabolism. It increases extraction efficiency. But eventually, compensation fails. And when it does, symptoms appear suddenly, even though the underlying process was gradual. The same pattern shows up with infections. Older adults who seemed healthy will develop pneumonia or a urinary tract infection, and instead of recovering normally, they deteriorate rapidly. Their immune response is sluggish. Their circulation can't deliver immune cells and antibiotics effectively to infected tissue. This isn't because they suddenly became frail. It's because their physiological reserve was already depleted. Now, you might be wondering, why don't doctors catch this? Why isn't there a test for this phase? The answer is complicated. Standard medical tests are designed to detect disease, not declining function. When you go for your annual checkup, we measure blood pressure at rest. We check cholesterol. We might do an EKG. We look at kidney and liver function through blood tests. These are valuable, but they're snapshots of static function. They don't tell us about dynamic capacity. They don't measure endothelial health directly. They don't assess vascular flexibility or nitric oxide production. There are specialized tests that can detect some of these changes. Flow-mediated dilation testing, where we use ultrasound to measure how well an artery expands in response to increased blood flow. Pulse wave velocity testing, which measures arterial stiffness. But these aren't part of routine care. They're research tools or tests used in specialized clinics. Most primary care doctors don't have access to them, and insurance doesn't typically cover them for screening purposes. So we end up in a situation where the most critical phase, the period where intervention would be most effective, goes unrecognized. By the time conventional tests show clear abnormalities, significant damage has already occurred. Let me explain something else that makes this phase particularly insidious. It's not distributed evenly across the population. Some people pass through it quickly. Others remain in this state of borderline compensation for years. The difference comes down to accumulated damage and individual variation in repair capacity. If you have a history of smoking, even if you quit years ago, your endothelial cells sustain damage that affects their long-term function. If you've had years of elevated blood sugar, that causes glycation, a process where sugar molecules bind to proteins and stiffen tissues, including vessel walls. If you've carried extra weight, particularly visceral fat, around your organs, that produces inflammatory chemicals that circulate constantly. If you've experienced chronic stress, the elevated cortisol affects blood pressure regulation. All of these factors accelerate the decline in physiological reserve. They move you through this vulnerable phase faster. And because they accumulate over decades, their effects aren't immediately visible. You can't feel your endothelium degrading. You can't sense arterial stiffness increasing. There's also a hydration component that most people underestimate. As we age, our sense of thirst becomes less reliable. At the same time, kidney function declines slightly, making us less efficient at conserving water. The result is that older adults are chronically underhydrated more often than they realize. Why does this matter? Because blood volume affects pressure and flow. When you're dehydrated, even mildly, your blood becomes more viscous. Your heart has to work harder to pump it. Small vessels, particularly in the brain and kidneys, are especially vulnerable to reduced flow when hydration drops. And here's something that surprises many people. Medication can mask what's happening during this phase. Blood pressure medications are essential for many people and prevent serious complications, but they work by forcing vessels to dilate or by reducing the heart's pumping force. They create artificial normal blood pressure numbers, which is protective, but they don't address the underlying endothelial dysfunction. I'm not suggesting people stop taking prescribed medications. That would be dangerous. What I'm pointing out is that medication can create a false sense of security. Your numbers look good, so you assume your vascular system is healthy. But the medication is compensating for declining function, not restoring it. So what does recognition of this phase actually look like? What should you be paying attention to? First, understand that the absence of symptoms doesn't mean the absence of change. If you're over 55, Some degree of endothelial decline is likely happening whether you feel it or not. That's not fatalism. That's biology. The question is whether that decline is slow and manageable or accelerating toward a threshold. Second, pay attention to subtle changes in functional capacity. Can you still climb 2 flights of stairs without stopping, or do you need to pause now? Do you feel as clear-headed in the late afternoon as you used to? How quickly do you recover from a busy day? These aren't just signs of getting older. They're indicators of declining reserve. Third, monitor changes in orthostatic tolerance. That's the technical term for how well you handle position changes. If you're starting to feel lightheaded when standing up, especially in the morning, that's a sign that vascular regulation is impaired. Many people dismiss this as normal aging, but it's actually a measurable dysfunction. Fourth, consider your inflammatory status. Do you have chronic pain, gum disease, digestive issues? These seemingly unrelated conditions all indicate elevated systemic inflammation, which directly damages endothelial function. Fifth, look at patterns rather than single events. One episode of dizziness might be meaningless, but if you're noticing a gradual increase in small incidents, minor symptoms that come and go, that pattern suggests you're in this transitional phase. Now, the important question: can this phase be slowed or reversed? The answer is nuanced. You cannot return your cardiovascular system to its state at age 30. That's not realistic. But you can absolutely slow the decline, and in some cases, you can restore measurable function. The key is understanding that endothelial health responds to specific inputs. Physical activity is the most powerful intervention we know of, not necessarily exercise in the sense of going to a gym, though that's valuable. I'm talking about consistent movement throughout the day. Walking, climbing stairs, gardening. Activities that create what we call shear stress on vessel walls. When blood flows faster, it creates friction against the endothelial cells. That friction is actually a signal. It triggers those cells to produce more nitric oxide. Studies have shown that even modest increases in daily movement produce measurable improvements in endothelial function within weeks. Nutrition plays a role, though not in the way most people think. This isn't about superfoods. It's about providing the biochemical building blocks for nitric oxide production and reducing oxidative stress. Dietary nitrates from vegetables, particularly leafy greens and beets, can be converted to nitric oxide through a pathway that doesn't require healthy endothelial function. Antioxidants from colorful vegetables help neutralize the stress that breaks down nitric oxide. Hydration matters more than most people realize. Maintaining consistent fluid intake throughout the day helps preserve blood volume and reduces the work your cardiovascular system has to do. Sleep quality affects vascular health through multiple mechanisms. During deep sleep, blood pressure drops, giving your cardiovascular system a chance to recover. Chronic sleep disruption elevates inflammatory markers, which directly impair endothelial function. Many older adults have undiagnosed sleep apnea, where breathing stops repeatedly during the night. This creates severe stress and prevents the restorative drop in blood pressure that should occur. Social connection and stress management affect vascular health through hormonal pathways. Chronic loneliness produces inflammatory states comparable to smoking. Chronic stress keeps cortisol elevated, which damages vessel walls over time. What I want you to understand is that this isn't about perfection. It's about recognizing that your vascular system is responsive. It's constantly adapting to the inputs you provide. And during this critical phase, when reserve is declining but failure hasn't occurred, those inputs matter enormously. The tragedy is that most people don't realize they're in this phase until it's past. They only recognize it in retrospect, after a health crisis, when they look back and realize there were signs they missed. But it's not inevitable. The difference between someone who maintains functional independence into their 80s and 90s versus someone who experiences rapid deterioration often comes down to what happened during this window. Whether they recognized it, whether they responded to it. I've watched this pattern play out hundreds of times in clinical practice. Patients who seem to be aging well suddenly decline. And when we dig into their history, we find that they passed through this phase years earlier without recognizing it. But I've also watched patients who did recognize the signs, who noticed subtle changes and took them seriously, who made modest adjustments and saw those adjustments pay off. Not in dramatic ways, but in sustained function, in maintained capacity. This is what I want you to take away. Your body is not a mystery. It follows biological principles. It responds to inputs. It has enormous capacity for adaptation, even in later decades of life. But it also has vulnerabilities, particularly during periods of transition when reserve is declining but symptoms haven't appeared. You cannot feel your endothelial function declining. You cannot sense your nitric oxide production dropping. That's why awareness matters. That's why understanding this phase is so critical, because by the time symptoms are obvious, you've already lost significant ground. The good news is that recognition itself is protective. When you understand what's happening biologically, you can make informed decisions. You can prioritize the activities that support vascular health. You can monitor subtle changes rather than waiting for dramatic symptoms. Your body is not working against you. It's responding to conditions. It's adapting as best it can with the resources available. The question is whether you're going to provide the conditions that allow it to maintain function. This isn't about fear. It's about respect. Respect for the complexity of what your cardiovascular system does every moment of every day. Respect for the decades of service it's already provided. Respect for the fact that it can still respond, still adapt if you give it what it needs. The phase exists. The data is clear. The biology is understood. What's not clear yet is whether you'll recognize it in yourself, whether you'll take it seriously, whether you'll understand that the absence of symptoms is not reassurance, but a warning. I've spent 3 decades studying these systems and watching data that consistently shows the same story. The people who do well are not necessarily the people with the best genetics. They're the people who paid attention during this phase, who didn't accept decline as inevitable. You are in control of more than you realize. Not everything, but more than you've been told. And the time that matters most is now, during this phase that most people miss entirely, when your body is quietly telling you that it needs support even though you feel fine. If you found this perspective valuable, consider subscribing for more evidence-based discussions about health and aging.